Somewhere on your street, this very week, someone is dragging a hydrangea out to the curb. Brown, brittle, the leaves gone to paper, the stems snapping like old pencils. They gave it every good intention. Water, a bag of bloom food, a hopeful spot beside the porch. And it quit on them anyway. So out it goes on trash day, and come spring they will buy another one, and start the same heartbreak over. Here is what I have learned, kneeling beside 100 plants that looked exactly that far gone. Most of them were not dead, not even close. And the few that truly were finished did not die of what their owner believed. They did not starve for the fertilizer on the shelf. They died a few inches down, in the soil we all quietly stopped paying attention to. So before you give up on yours, before you reach for a single thing to feed it, give me these next few minutes. Because there is a 1-minute test that tells you whether the plant in your yard is finished or only waiting. And after that, I am going to walk you through 10 free, or nearly free, things that bring a struggling hydrangea back. The honest 10. The ones that actually work. And along the way, I will tell you plainly which famous tricks are only wasting your afternoon. Start right here, before anything else. Take your thumbnail, or a pocket knife, and scratch a small window in the bark of a main stem, down low, maybe 6 inches up from the soil. If you see a thin ribbon of green just under the surface, that plant is alive. The top can look like a bundle of dead sticks. The leaves can be long gone, but green under the bark means the plant is still holding on, waiting for a reason to come back. If that first stem is brown and dry all the way through, do not quit. Try another, and another, working your way down toward the base. A great many hydrangeas die back at the tips and are perfectly alive down low, and 2 of the most common kinds in American yards do this on purpose. The smooth hydrangeas, the old Annabelle sort, and the panicle hydrangeas, your limelight and its cousins, can freeze right to the ground in a hard winter and rise again from the roots come late spring. So that pile of sticks you were ready to pull in April may simply be a plant that has not woken up yet. Now the second half of the test, and this one saves more hydrangeas than any fertilizer ever will. Push a finger 4 inches down into the soil, right beside the crown. If it comes up cool and damp, or worse, wet and sour smelling, set the watering can down and step away. A wilting hydrangea and a drowning hydrangea look exactly alike. And the instinct to water the wilt is what finishes off more of these plants than any drought ever could. When the soil down deep is already wet, the trouble is not hunger, and it is not thirst. It is roots that cannot breathe. No amount of feeding fixes that. Only better drainage does. Feed a plant with rotting roots, and you are setting a fine supper in front of someone far too sick to eat. If you have poured money and worry into a plant and watched it sulk anyway, I want you to hear this plainly. That was never your fault. You did just what the bag told you to do. But the bag was written to sell you the next bag. It was never written to build you a soil that could hold water through a July afternoon and feed a plant slowly, all season long. A hydrangea leans on the ground beneath it more than almost any shrub you can grow. Those big soft leaves and heavy blooms drink hard, and when the soil underneath is thin, packed, and lifeless, the plant runs out of room to catch its breath the very first week the heat rolls in. So the real work, the work that actually revives one of these, is never about forcing a chemical into a stressed plant. It is about feeding the soil back to life so the soil can feed the plant. And here is the quiet reason nobody ever put that on a shelf. You cannot bottle a handful of old leaves. You cannot patent a bucket of worm castings or a pile of coffee grounds. There is no spring reorder in it, no brand, no margin in a thing your neighbor hands you over the fence for free. It was never hidden from you. It simply had no one with a reason to keep reminding you it exists. Dr. Jeff Gilman, a horticulture professor who now runs the botanical gardens at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, wrote a whole book testing garden remedies one by one to see which ones actually hold up. That is exactly the work in front of us now, sorting the free thing that works from the sold thing that does not. 10 of them. Let us begin. We start with the one already sitting in your kitchen this morning. Used coffee grounds. Now, you have heard they will acidify your soil and turn your blooms blue, and I have to be straight with you, because that one simply is not true. Once you have brewed your pot, the grounds left behind sit very close to neutral. The acid mostly stayed in your cup. Dr. Gilman and the extension researchers at Washington State have both put that little myth to bed. So if it is blue flowers you are chasing, grounds will not get you there. What they will do is quieter and better. Coffee grounds are food for the living things in your soil, the bacteria and fungi that do the real work of feeding a plant. They carry a slow, gentle bit of nitrogen, the nutrient behind green leaves and fresh growth, and they hand it over at the pace a recovering plant can actually use, instead of the jolt a synthetic feed gives to roots that are already stressed. Here is how to use them. A thin scattering, no thicker than a ½ inch, raked lightly into the top of the soil out around the drip line. That is the ring of ground under the outer edge of the leaves, where the hungry feeding roots are waiting. Then water it in. And the mistake to avoid: do not pile them up thick against the stem. Wet coffee grounds can mat into a crust that sheds water instead of letting it soak through. Thin and scattered feeds the soil. Heaped and packed only smothers it. Number 2 is the gentlest feed I know, and the first thing I reach for when a plant is truly weak. Worm castings. That dark, crumbly stuff earthworms leave behind, sold in a bag as vermicompost, or free if you keep a little worm bin down under the sink. Here is why they are so kind to a plant in trouble. A stressed hydrangea can be burned by a strong fertilizer. The roots are in no shape to handle it. Worm castings almost never burn, no matter how generous you are, because the goodness comes out slow and mild, wrapped in a whole living community of helpful microbes that go straight to work in the soil. How to use them: scratch a handful or two into the surface around the base, keeping back a few inches from the crown, and water it in. Or make what the old gardeners called a castings tea. A couple of big spoonfuls stirred into a watering can, left to sit an hour, then poured over the root zone. On a plant that is simply hungry, not rotting, remember, you checked, you can watch the color deepen and the posture lift within a few days. That is about as close to instant as honest gardening ever gets. The mistake: do not expect castings to fix a drainage problem or hold up a floppy stem. They feed, they do not drain. Which brings me to a myth worth clearing out of your shed for good. If someone told you crushed eggshells are a quick calcium fix that stops your blooms from flopping, let it go. Eggshells take years to break down in ordinary soil, and floppy hydrangea stems are almost never a calcium problem. It is the variety, and heavy blooms full of rain, and sometimes too much nitrogen and too much shade. Save the shells for the compost pile where they belong, and do not wait on them to rescue a thing. Number 3 might be the most powerful free thing on this whole list, and it is the one folks rake up and haul away by the bagful every single fall. Shredded leaves. A hydrangea is a woodland plant at heart. Its wild cousins grow at the edge of the trees, in the deep, soft, leaf-fed soil of the forest floor. That soil is run by fungi, and fungi are exactly what a pile of leaves feeds. Run your mower over a heap of fallen leaves to chop them up, and you have made what gardeners call leaf mold. Nature's own compost. The closest thing on earth you can give a hydrangea to the ground it was born to love. How to use it: lay a couple of inches of shredded leaves over the whole root zone, out to the drip line, and pull it back a hand's width from the stem so the crown can breathe. It holds moisture through the hot months, keeps the soil cool, and melts down into rich, dark earth that feeds the plant for months on end. The mistake: do not lay down whole, flat leaves in a thick, wet blanket. Big ones, like oak or sycamore, can pack into a soggy mat that water runs right off of. Shred them first. Chopped, they melt into the soil. Whole, they smother it. It costs you nothing but the time to run the mower, and it does more for a struggling hydrangea than a whole season of anything in a bottle. Number 4 is sitting in your grass catcher right now. Fresh grass clippings. Green and free, they are surprisingly rich in nitrogen, and as they break down, they hand it gently to the soil. A mild, steady feed for a plant trying hard to push out new leaves. How to use them: a thin layer, an inch at the very most, spread over the root zone, and best of all after they have dried in the sun for a day. You can lay them right on top of your leaf mulch. The mistakes here matter more than usual, so stay with me. First, never pile clippings on thick and wet. They turn into a hot, slimy, sour mat that does the exact opposite of what you want. Thin and dry, always. And second, and this is the one almost nobody warns you about, Do not use clippings from a lawn that has been treated with weed killer. Some of the newer broadleaf weed killers pass right through the grass, survive in the clippings, and can twist and stunt a hydrangea for a whole season. If you, or a lawn service, have sprayed the yard, keep those clippings well away from your flower beds. But from a clean, untreated lawn, they are one of the finest free feeds you have got. Number 5 is one my grandmother swore by, and it turns out she had it right all along. Old aquarium water. If you keep a freshwater fish tank, that water you pour down the drain on cleaning day is a mild, ready-made plant food. A little nitrogen, a little phosphorus, and a good helping of the very same easygoing microbes your soil is hungry for, all in a form a stressed plant can sip without one bit of shock. How to use it? There is nothing to it. When you change the tank, carry that old water out and pour it slow over the root zone instead of down the sink. It is gentle enough to use every time you clean the glass. 2 honest cautions, and then you are set. This is for freshwater tanks only. Never a saltwater or a marine tank, because that salt will harm both your soil and your plant. And if you dose your tank with medicine or chemicals, skip it that week. But plain old freshwater tank water is a small, free gift most people wash right down the sink without a second thought. Number 6 comes straight out of the back to the land days, the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of us first learned there was another way to garden. Comfrey. It is a big, bristly, deep-rooted plant that the old-timers grew in a forgotten corner on purpose. Because those roots reach far down and pull up potassium, the nutrient that helps a plant move water and stand up to the heat, and they store it in the leaves. Cut a few of those leaves, drop them in a bucket of water, and let them steep a couple of weeks. What you get is a dark and frankly stinky liquid that is one of the great homemade plant feeds. Rich in potassium and free, year after year, from a single plant in the corner. How to use it? Dilute that dark brew down to the color of weak tea and pour it over the root zone once every couple of weeks through the growing season. Now, one firm word, because I care about the folks watching. Comfrey tea is a feed for your plants. It is never a drink for you. Taken internally, it is hard on the human liver, and it has no business in your kitchen. Fed to the soil, though, it is a gift straight from a gentler era of gardening. And while we are clearing the air, that banana peel water everyone steeps on the windowsill, the potassium you are after stays locked up inside the peel. Soaking it a day or two barely lets any of it out at all. Bury the peels in your compost, where the microbes can free it slowly, and let the comfrey do the potassium work in the meantime. Let me pause for just 1 second. Because everything we have covered so far, the 1 minute alive or not test, the honest 10, how much of each, and exactly where it goes, and the short list of tricks to skip, I have gathered onto a single page you can tape inside the shed door or tuck in with your garden gloves. Point your phone's camera at the code on your screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, no email. Then stay right here with me, because the next 4 are the heavy hitters, the ones that do not just feed a hydrangea but rebuild the very ground it lives in. And the last one is the single most important thing in this entire video. Number 7 comes out of the fireplace, or the fire pit, and it is genuinely useful, but it is the one on this list you have got to respect. So listen close. Wood ash, from clean, untreated wood, carries real potassium and calcium, and it sweetens sour, acidic ground. In an old, tired, acidic soil, a light dusting can wake a plant right up. But that very same power is exactly why you must go careful. How to use it? A thin scatter, no more than a cup around a mature shrub, worked lightly into the soil in early spring, and only once you know your soil runs acidic. A $5 test kit from the garden center tells you in minutes. Now the mistakes, and there are a few. Because wood ash pushes the soil toward pink, keep it well away from any hydrangea you are trying to keep blue, or it will undo the color. Never use ash from charcoal briquettes, or painted or treated lumber, or glossy paper. Only clean wood ash, and go light. Too much too often drives the soil so far the other way that the plant cannot take up iron, and the leaves go yellow. And this, by the way, is the honest answer to 2 tricks you have surely been sold: a spoon of baking soda, or a scoop of Epsom salt, to change your bloom color. Skip them both, Baking soda is mostly sodium, and sodium is flat-out toxic to roots. It is the last thing a struggling plant needs. Epsom salt is magnesium, which does nothing for color, and piled on it can actually crowd out the calcium your plant does need. If you truly want to nudge the color, do it the real way. A proper garden lime toward pink or elemental sulfur toward blue, slowly, over a whole season, with a soil test in your hand. Number 8 is as old as farming itself. Well-rotted manure. From a horse, a cow, or a backyard flock of chickens. Once it has properly aged, it is one of the richest soil builders you can lay your hands on. Full of nutrients, and teeming with the microbial life that makes a soil come alive. Country folks have brought tired ground back with it for 1,000 years. How to use it. A 1 to 2 inch layer over the root zone, out to the drip line, in early spring or fall, and just left there for the earthworms to carry down. No need to dig it in and disturb the roots. The mistake, and this one is important, it must be aged. Well rotted, at least 6 months old, dark and crumbly and earthy smelling. Fresh manure is far too strong. It will burn the very roots you are trying to save, and it can carry things you do not want near the food growing on nearby beds. If you are not certain it is fully aged, let it sit another season, or run it through the compost pile first. Old and mellow, it is black gold. Fresh and hot, it is a costly mistake. Number 9 is not a feed at all. It is a blanket, and it may be the single most underused tool a home gardener owns. A good layer of wood chip mulch over the root zone. Here is why it belongs on a list about bringing a plant back. Half the reason a hydrangea collapses in July is that the soil around its roots swings from baked to bone dry and back again, day after day, and those shallow roots simply cannot keep up. 2 or 3 inches of wood chips puts an end to that. It holds the moisture in, keeps the soil cool and steady, straight through a heat wave, smothers the weeds that steal water, and, slowly and quietly, breaks down into more of that living soil we keep coming back to. Years of extension research, including the wood chip studies out of Washington State, keep landing on the very same point. A simple layer of chips does more for a struggling shrub than most of what you can buy. How to use it. 2 to 3 inches over the whole root zone, and, say it with me, pulled back a good hand's width from the stem. The one mistake that undoes it all. Never pile mulch up against the trunk in a little volcano. Heaped against the crown, it traps moisture on the bark and invites the very rot you are working so hard to avoid. A donut, never a volcano. Do this one thing, and every other feed on this list works better, because now the soil holds on to what you give it. And number 10. If you forget the other 9, remember this one. Finished compost. Dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling, broken all the way down. It is the single best thing you will ever give a hydrangea, because it is the only one that fixes the real problem instead of the symptom. Most struggling hydrangeas are not short one nutrient. They are planted in tired, packed, lifeless ground, and compost brings that ground back to life. It feeds the whole underground community at once. The bacteria and the fungi that unlock nutrients, hold water, and fend off disease, so the plant does not have to. The Rodale Institute has run trials for decades on compost-fed, living soil, and it is the same story every time. The soil grows stronger, and the plants grow tougher, year after year. How to use it. 2 to 3 inches spread over the root zone in spring or fall, right on top of the soil, and let the worms do the digging for you. On a plant in mid-season trouble, a gentler single inch worked lightly into the surface, then watered in, starts the healing without disturbing the roots. There is no real mistake to avoid here, except one. Expecting it overnight. And this is where honesty matters most, so let me give you the true timeline. The first year, you are feeding the soil, and the plant steadies. The wilting eases. The color comes back. By the second year, the roots have gone down deep into ground that finally holds water, and the blooms come back fuller. By the third year, you have a plant that mostly takes care of itself. One that shrugs off the July heat that used to flatten it. That is not a slow answer. That is a permanent one. And it costs you nothing but your kitchen scraps and a little patience. That hydrangea at the curb, the one I opened with, I have carried plenty of them back from the edge over the years. But the one I still think about was my grandmother's. Pale blue, leaning against the porch rail, older than I was, The summer she passed, it browned and dropped every leaf, and I was sure I had lost it right along with her. I did the scratch test almost by accident, and there it was, that thin green line under the bark, still holding on. I did not feed it anything clever. I gave it a season of leaf mold and compost and then left it be, the way she always had. It bloomed the very next July. It still does. She never once fed those plants, you know. She fed the ground beneath them, the way her own mother taught her, and the plants took care of themselves. So before you drag yours out to the curb, kneel down and look for the green. Give the soil one honest season. More often than you would ever believe, the plant was only waiting for someone to feed the ground instead of the leaves. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, the patient, honest, feed the soil kind, then you already belong here. Subscribe and let us keep tending the old way, together. And if you would, tell me down in the comments which of the 10 you are starting with and what growing zone you garden in. I read them and I answer. Now go on out there and look for the green.